And it looks like we are live. Welcome, everyone, to this live stream. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my Patreon supporters. They make this channel possible. They really do. And they make awesome interviews with awesome guests like Daniel Hawk possible. So, first of all, Daniel has the coolest name of anyone that I've interviewed on this channel. But if that's not enough for you, he's also professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Ashland Theological Seminary, where he's been for over 20 years. He's also the author of the book the Violence of the Biblical God, published in 2019. And that is the title of this live stream that I've plagiarized from that book. That's the topic for today. So you can go to the description box and find out how to get your own copy of the book. You'll want that, and to also learn more about Professor Hawk from his bio. Dan, welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So I do anticipate that this interview will fill our time quickly. So let's get right to it. We, especially in this digital age, want very easy answers. I know I want quick answers. When something comes into my head, a question, I want to type it in and have the answer on the screen. Very short and succinct, preferably not even a whole sentence. Just give me a phrase. That's the answer. Less than 10 seconds, start to finish. I like the dedication of your book. You dedicate it to your sons, and you say that they are not pleased or not impressed, I think, with easy answers. So perhaps you or someone you know in the past tried some easy answers to this question of God and violence. And I wonder if you could start by letting us understand some of the background there behind the dedication in your book.
Oh, well, sure. Well, I mean, we live in an information age, right? So it's common really to view the Bible primarily as a source of information. So um, this is a book that gives us the information about how we should live, how we should, what we should believe, how we should act, so on and so forth. And at least that was my approach to the Bible some time ago. And so I guess the best way to say this is I've been through a metamorphosis in my own thinking. Um, I actually came out of seminary really feeling like I had the answers. I was equipped, I was ready to go, and I was able to deal with the ethical issues, the questions that people had. Um, and I spent 5 years in the pastorate, actually, which got me in touch with the fact that life is a little messier. It spills over some of those really neat categories that I had. And actually, I was deeply committed to a kind of a categorical stance of nonviolence, and it just over the course of time, I just I just wasn't satisfied with the way that violence was being handled, interpreted in the Bible. I mean, lots of different ways to, in a sense, to try to get God off the hook, or to explain God's activities, God's violent activities, in ways that would tie up all the loose ends and keep things within the box. And I just came to the point. I mean, a lot of things have played into this, but an evolving sense of my sense of Scripture and how it functions as an inspired and authoritative text for Christians, coming to the point where I'm thinking that Scripture, even though Scripture does give us lots of guidance, lots of information, lots of um, information. It seems to me that really the role the role of Scripture more deeply, by virtue of how disparate and diverse its contents and perspectives are, um, that it's a text that really invites Christians into a conversation about how to live faithfully as God's people. And so my orientation is not so much now to seek biblical answers, but to think biblically. So, what is the answer? to this problem. Once we figure that out, we get it, we can move on. And there's a lot of that out there. And I have come to the sense that Scripture, as I said, signals the kind of reading community, the kind of community that reads it faithfully. And that's a community that has those diversity of perspectives bound together by a covenant, set of commitments, a common narrative. And I just don't think there's a template that fits every single situation in every context easily.
So you mentioned narrative, and that's a key word that I want the audience to keep in mind. The subtitle of your book is Canonical Narrative and Christian Theology. And so now I'd like to take some time, and this is really important for the viewers to understand. As some background, and you know this, and just for the viewers' information, in the description box, there's a link to another interview I did on this topic with William Webb and Gordon Ostie. And their book is one of a series, not a series, it's one of several contemporary approaches to this problem. And I think, Dan, that you use a phrase in your book, something like it's historical theological. So they're looking at the historical side of it, and they're also looking at it from the perspective of biblical theology. But there's a lot of influence there from extra biblical ancient Near Eastern material, and they're trying to put all this together into an interpretive whole. And so the audience should be familiar with that. We're not going to review that too much, but just so you know that it's there. And as I said, there are several that approach the topic in this way. But your methodology is a bit different. And so I'd like you to unpack at a bird's eye view how your methodology is different from theirs. And is it mutually exclusive? Can there be some overlap? Or how do you put those two together?
Well, in a nutshell, it seems to be that most of the ways that this topic has been addressed is from a historical perspective. So the idea of looking at the Bible as a witness, as a testimony to what God said in the past, what God did in the past. So a historical focus. And that's over the last couple of hundred years, that's generated just some very, very helpful ways of, and critical ways of interpreting the Bible. But it also rests upon a certain confidence that we can reconstruct the past well, that we can get into an ancient writer's or an ancient community's minds, and without projecting our own self into that process. So this historical orientation, which is the way most Christians operate. Well, what did God say? What did God do? Is different than coming to Scripture as primarily as a text, as a canonical, in this sense, a canonical narrative. Reading, for example, reading the story of the Bible, not so much saying, well, how does this reflect what God did or God said in the past? But, and I'm a narrative critic, so I think a lot about narrative and story and how it works. And so the idea is basically, how do we approach Scripture as a narrative, as the narrative that explains who we are, explains who God is, explains the world to us. I mean, this narrative and identity really work hand in glove. So you go to family gatherings, for example, sometimes, and people are telling, at least in my family, we tell stories, and we tend to tell the same stories sometimes. And we don't tell the same stories because we're afraid we're going to forget them. We tell the same stories because in some way they remind us of who we are. They reinforce our sense of identity, a sense of who we are as a family in the world. And so I see scripture functioning in that way. So for me, and so I, when I look at the biblical canon, and I note that the canon itself has a kind of a broad narrative arc, beginning with creation, ending with new creation. And I look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they start with narratives. It's a way of saying you've got to know the story first. And everything else that you read, everything else that follows, all the other kinds of material within the narratives are to be interpreted in light of the story. Um, and if we look at the Bible primarily as a source of information primarily, or principles, then the narratives are just examples of the principles. And I think that's backwards. One of the really fascinating things about narrative is when we tell stories, we actually engage the amygdala, that little part of the brain that oversees our emotions. So that doesn't happen when we're reading information or data or expository material, but when we tell stories in some way deeper than we understand, we are invested. We are engaged emotionally, and when you're engaged emotionally, you're going to live out scripture differently than if you think of it as a compendium of principles and beliefs. So a little farther probably than where you wanted to go, but so my approach just says I'm taking this text as it is. I'm going to read that story, and I'm going to see where it takes me. And some of the places it took me, I didn't feel very comfortable with, but this is wonderfully rich and sophisticated literature, and it leaves lots of gaps and dots that don't connect, and has lots of ways of drawing us in emotionally and as a community to interpretation.
Yeah, I resonate with so much of what you said. We have a small group study that I'm involved in, and I'm trying to get people into a narrative approach. And there are some, I guess it's new to them. I mean, how many Christians keep up with biblical hermeneutics, right? And so it's new to them, and so they're
Yeah.
very, very afraid of it. But what
Mhm.
you just said, I've used those same arguments. I mean, it's we can get away from the mechanicalness of some other interpretive methods, and we can use narrative, and it's so refreshing, and that's what I keep trying to enforce. I mean, do you want JEDP and all of the derivatives? Do you want to split up like Genesis 2:4 and say this goes to this source, this goes to, or do you want to read it as a canonical whole? I mean, it's not really all that difficult a choice. And I think I expressed this in an email to you earlier, but what surprised me about your book is that I never thought of applying sort of a narrative approach to this topic. So it's a very refreshing and very informative treatment. So let's see if we can kind of sketch out some of the way that your book deals with the topic of biblical violence. And I'd like to start with the first several chapters of Genesis. So I'll bring up some apparently contrasting portraits of God and violence, and I'd like you to comment on them. So, in contrast to what we might expect compared to other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, Genesis starts with no violence. There's no one god battling another god and so forth. Okay. A couple of chapters later, we have Cain and his murder. And then Cain seems to complain about God's judgment on him. And then we're probably thinking now of an eye for an eye. God's judgment's very light. And then Cain basically complains about his judgment. And God says, okay, I'll protect you, and anyone who tries to get revenge, I'll avenge sevenfold. And then later on in the flood account, we have God just wiping people off of the face of the earth. So, no violence during creation, seemingly an odd reaction to violence with Cain, and then we have the flood. So, how do these fit together? Do they contrast? Do they complement each other with your narrative approach?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So I would begin in Genesis 1 and 2, um, again with creation, with how it portrays God and God's intention for humanity and for creation as a whole is blessing, is flourishing, is uh, in a sense living in the fullness of God's goodness and beneficence. And so we human beings have an exalted place in that creation hierarchy. We are, in a sense, we're God's field rep. We're God's representative on the ground to manage this beautiful creation. But I think what we've got to do is, and so I see those first chapters of Genesis, even in God's response to Adam and Eve, as portraying a God who is deeply um, involved in caring, seeking the good of all creation. So we've got a lot of, um, in a sense, we got a lot of images, the kind of this angry, vengeful God of the Old Testament. We've got a lot of images that in a sense, we need to maybe just set aside for a while and really take a look at this God who gives. Gives and blesses. So that's where we start. Um, and you're right. So the first act of violence is by a human being who kills another human being. And the strange thing is, God doesn't kill him. Uh, God actually shows mercy. And I think what keeps us back sometimes is that we have this idea that God's violence and God's anger and God's judgment, God's response to human sin and rebellion are all tied up. I mean, human sin makes God angry. So God judges because God is angry, and when God judges, there is violence. And in fact, what I discovered while I was working through the biblical text is we need to uncouple those three threads. So God judges, but is not always violent, and Cain is an example. God gets angry, but God doesn't always judge. So the first time actually God is said to be angry in the narrative um, is in Exodus. God isn't mad at anybody, or isn't said to be mad at anybody in Genesis, even though God is involved in massive violence. Matter of fact, the first emotion attributed to God in response to sin is grief, and that's at the flood narrative. So, God isn't angered; God is grieved. So, this idea of a vengeful, angry God who just is, in a sense, is waiting in heaven with a giant human swatter to whack somebody that gets out of line. I just don't see reflected. I see a deity who is much like the deity that is um, incarnated in Jesus Christ.
When we come to the flood, it's interesting. You note in your book that God is portrayed almost hands off of the steering wheel. In Genesis 7, it's almost like passive. The windows of heaven were opened, um, the fountains of the deep burst forth. And prior to that, it's been this relationship between God and Noah. God says, do something, Noah does it. God says, do something else, Noah does it. And then Genesis 7, God is kind of hands off. There's a summary statement, as you mentioned in your book, that, this is what happened. And then Genesis 8, God is kind of back on the scene. God remembers Noah. And then he begins to do something. And when God does something there, it looks like creation all over again. Would you say that God is still outside um, of the human systems at this point? If we look at kind of God working
Mhm.
within or without of the human system, um, he's kind of outside of it.
Right. Yeah, I think I would agree with you. God in that those first 11 chapters is aloof, disengaged, and it seems to me one of the reasons the flood story is told is one of the reasons is to answer the question. Well, you know, if this world had gotten was so bad and rotten, why doesn't God just tear it down and make a new one? And
Right.
the flood story says, well, God did, and it didn't work. So I think all of that sets up um, the real thread of Israel's story, which is what begins with the calling of Abraham. So what I trace in the beginning of the book through Genesis and Exodus, um, there are some discrete and strategic places in the narrative where we are told God came down,
Mm.
God descended. So, which I take to be a way of talking about God actually entering in to human experience, no longer kind of staying uh, aloof in a sense, superintending from afar, but really entering in. And with each descent, in a way, God is pulled deeper into human experience and the maelstrom of violence that really characterizes this ungodly mess that we've made of the world that God called good.
Yeah, that's really interesting to put it that way because typically with the Tower of Babel, if you read like an Old Testament background commentary or something, it's a ziggurat and God's descend, on the ziggurat, and so God comes down, and it's kind of an ironic, which it still could be that God descends
Oh,
just like they
sure.
wanted, but it
Yeah.
wasn't what they expected, and so you can have that's what I love about this sort of narrative approach. I mean, it's these referents they can be concrete, but they can also point to something in the narrative that gives you a bigger picture of what's going on. And so we transition then from God coming down in Babel to God sort of coming down again with Abram. God speaks to Abraham or Abram. And then we find God acting somewhat in a puzzling way with Abram as well, because there are certain times when God is very involved in what Abram's doing, right? He strikes Pharaoh the first time Abram lies about his sister, and then other times, when there's a battle with a bunch of kings in Genesis 14, God is kind of hands off and lets
Mhm.
Abram do what he's going to do. So, how do we think about this in terms of God being within or without the human system? It seems to be at times God is working within it and then kind of backing off again.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's fascinating. So, I really draw on the work of Terence Fretheim, who's in this respect, who's really talked a lot about the relationality of God, God being a relational being. Um, and it seems to me that the whole thread of Israel's story testifies to a God who chooses to renew the world in partnership with human friends, and in a sense, that requires that has a cost for God, because if God is going to, for whatever reason, choose this family, Abram and his family, to be agents of renewal and reconciliation and healing for this world, and God is going to do that relationally, that means that right off the bat, God's going to take sides and identifying with this partner, this friend. And I just love the way in the Abraham story, there's a deepening of the relationship, and you just see God forming a relationship with it's a reciprocal. So God shows up, uh, gives a promise or some more information on the promise to Abram, and Abram responds in some way, and they go deeper and deeper until God comes down to check out Sodom and Gomorrah, because God has heard something has gotten God's attention. And this is just this remarkable story where God is pondering, God thinking through, I wonder if I should tell Abraham what I'm thinking of doing. I mean, here is God bringing a human friend into God's confidence. I mean, which really specifies a deep sense of relationality. But so we've got God building this relationship, and then sometimes God just lets things go. But I think it gets messy for God, right? I mean, you mentioned poor Abimelech. I mean, so Abraham and Sarah go and take refuge, and Abraham is really fearful, and tell him you're my sister. And I mean, God has to stick up. God sticks up for God's friend, even though God's friend is in the wrong. So I think there's a lot in this story that really portrays, in a sense, the beauty, the wonder, and the intricacy and the messiness of being in relationship with God in the world. And so, yeah, so Tower of Babylon, God comes down, and the folks are they're there to make a name for themselves, preeminence, identity. And God opposes that. Later on, God opposes Pharaoh. And interestingly enough, in the story, Pharaoh has no name, even though we begin the book of Exodus with all kinds of Israelite names. So you've got lots of Israelites who have names, and you have this Pharaoh who's anonymous. I mean, so there's all to say that there's just so much richness and symbolism and things going on here that, really it seems to me flesh out, in a sense, what God gets the divine self into with the decision to befriend and work through human beings. And I think that's something that really can speak to every Christian, every follower.
You're making a lot of comments that I hope viewers are picking up on, not even directly related to the topic, but just how the narrative works together in different parts. And we can illustrate that further. Let's jump to Exodus, and maybe this is overreading, but I've always thought, I'm no narrative critic like yourself, but we have genealogies in Genesis 5, and then we have violence at the beginning of Genesis 6, and then we have this incident with the sons of God. We have a brief genealogy at the beginning of Exodus 1, and then we have Pharaoh. He's doing an act of violence, and Pharaoh is like the gods of Egypt. So to me, it seems to signal at the beginning of Exodus that there's some very sinister stuff happening. And Pharaoh, in his violence, is directly opposing the creation blessing, because Israel is being fruitful and multiplying, which is great for business. If you're Pharaoh, you need slaves, but they're also growing strong. And so Pharaoh then shows up as the one who's going to oppose the creation blessing. And I think you talk about moving from a family to a nation to a kingdom. And so at this point in the narrative, we're saying, okay, we have family. Now we're looking at the creation of a new nation. And the viewer, this, but the viewer should keep in mind from a narrative level that the Exodus is described in creation language, both decreation for the plagues and then creation when Israel leaves Egypt. It's really fascinating, especially the song at the sea. But here then, so we're at the transition perhaps from a family to the creation of a nation. And in the Exodus account, as you point out, the humans, Aaron, Moses, the Israelites, are very much separate from the violence that happens, particularly as you note with the Passover. Moses and Aaron are kind of the spokesman. It's interesting that they take the role of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is like the gods of Egypt, and God tells Moses that you will be like Pharaoh, or you will be like God to Pharaoh. So Moses begins to take Pharaoh's place, and God takes the place of the gods of Egypt and shows that he is the one who maintains order and chaos. But again, I'm no narrative critic, so those are my thoughts. But does this help us understand how violence is portrayed in the Exodus? That God is setting himself up as king of a nation, and he is making a name for himself. And this is how you make a name for yourself in the ancient Near Eastern context.
Yeah, yeah. I love the way you're filling in, playing with the story and kind of threading it out in these ways. So one of the refrains you'll recall in the plague narrative is God saying, "Then the Egyptians will know," and also saying to Israel, "Then you will know." Um, so, or then they will know that I am Yahweh. So this idea, this clash of between the anonymous Pharaoh, who is like the ultra male, alpha male in the world, and this God who comes into a world of established gods who've been, the Egyptian gods have been presiding over this order for centuries, if not millennia. And then you've got a God of slaves coming in saying, all right, um, release my people so they can come worship. So in a sense, God is like the new deity on the block. I mean, and so there's this, I think that's one of the reasons why we have this protracted narrative, because God is teaching people whose warped cosmology is connected to a violent society. And again, until we get to that climax where God demonstrates God's supreme power over life and death and creation itself. It's just a remarkable, and along the way hardens Pharaoh's heart, so that Pharaoh, in a sense, can't make independent decisions, which is a pretty sad thing if you're a ruler who considers himself ultimate.
Yeah, it's interesting how he becomes less and less powerful uh, as the narrative goes on, as well as his magicians. I don't know if you mentioned this, or is it someone else, that his magicians, Pharaoh's magicians, can contribute to the chaos, but they can't reverse it.
Mm.
Fascinating. Um, as we move into the conquest now, I think that you bring up the covenant code in Exodus 20 through 23. That's very important to understand. And the way I read your treatment of this, it's really critical, because we think of the covenant often as binding God's people to him, which is correct, but it also binds God to his people. And when
Yeah.
we read what comes after, now we have to consider with what happens to Israel as a nation, that not only is Israel bound to God, but that God is bound to them. And now he seems more compelled, perhaps, to act more consistently and more frequently within the system, political,
Mhm.
social system that Israel finds itself. So, is that a correct understanding?
Yeah, I think that's, couldn't have said it better myself, or probably didn't. So this idea that it if God, if in a sense, God is going to now identify with, form a new people that reflects who God is, God's attributes, God's character in the world. If God is going to use this people as the agent of renewal, then in a sense, God is bound to promote its welfare and to defend that nation against its enemies, and to provide it a place, because identity is often so much tied to place. So I don't know if you want to really pursue that the whole conquest of Canaan, but it's clear in the covenant code that what God is intending to do is drive people out. That's expel them or dispossess, or however you want to put that, which is the way that the latter half of the book of Joshua talks about what God does. And in the first part of Joshua, we've got all this wiping out language, putting under the ban, devoting to destruction, however you want to, that references back to Deuteronomy, and which has some really deep theological resonances. There's something going on in the Deuteronomic command. So Deuteronomy is like theology in the form of law. But all of that wiping out language is, as we know, is carried. And this is how this is a piece where historical research helps us. We know that that's conventional military language. I mean, it's all exaggerated. It's all, we had this great and devastating victory. So when you get into Joshua and you read all of this, and it's read within Deuteronomy, in which there are some other things going. I mean, consider the commandment in Deuteronomy 7. When you go into the land, wipe them out. Leave no one breathing. And then it goes on to say, don't make a covenant. Don't give your daughters in marriage, which seems a little strange, given that first wipe them out. I mean, if wiping out is the real thing, why are you telling them? I mean, who's left to intermarry, in a sense?
Right.
So there's something going on there, and then you've got this kind of militaristic language, and then you've got the second part of Joshua that goes back to the original Sinai language, almost as if, it's so abrupt that it's almost as if the biblical narrator is saying, well, it didn't quite happen exactly right like that. And you can recognize that kind of language for what it is. The important thing is God prevailed and brought Israel into the land in fulfillment of God's promises to their ancestors.
Yeah, and this is one way that your book overlaps with some other contemporary approaches, is recognizing the hyperbole, as you say. It's very clear from the biblical text itself, when we compare, Joshua to Joshua, Joshua to Judges, 1 Samuel 15 even is, the people are still there in 1 Samuel 27, 1 Samuel 30. And this does seem very strange to some people. I mean, they want to read, well, that's total kill language. I think that we can all imagine. I saw on the news today that Putin pulled out of Ukraine. I'm certain that Putin is not saying that he lost. I'm certain that he is proclaiming to his people a victory, a strategic victory, whatever it is. This type of thing has been happening for a very long time. And so, yeah, that's always important to keep in mind. What is so important about the land in the ancient Near East? That certainly is not intuitive to me, a modern Westerner. Probably is to people in the Middle East, I suppose, and other places. But why is the land so important? And this is kind of tied to the question that you address in your book. Well, God needed to get rid of the Canaanites because they were so sinful. And the land just happened to be where the Canaanites were. This might be one of those let God off of the hook answers that you
Yeah.
alluded to at the beginning of the interview. So can you address that?
Um, I can offer the definitive example. I'm sure I can wrap it all up in a nice bow and tie it up. But seriously, there's an interesting little sidelight. I think it's in the end of Deuteronomy 2, where Moses is talking about other peoples that God has brought into their land, and who drove out the inhabitants. And God was a part of that. It's a way of saying, in a sense, to Israel, this this experience you've had of being brought into a land, you're not unique, and it so that it frames that whole Israelite conquest against the backdrop of God's mysterious working within the nations of the world. Um, but if we're thinking through, and I'm sorry, just could you repeat your question again? It just went out of my head.
Yeah, the question was effectively about the claim that God
Ah, the land.
had to wipe the Canaanites out because of sin and the
Yeah,
land, but yeah,
gotcha.
yeah,
So it's interesting to note, at least to me, that the book of Joshua nowhere attributes the expulsion of the Canaanites to their sinfulness. And matter of fact, there's only two texts in the Old Testament that even could be obliquely given as a reason. And that's God telling Abraham in Genesis 15 that the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its fill. And then there's a text in Deuteronomy, a rhetorical text where God is saying, "Well, don't think that I'm bringing you into this land because you're so good. It's because the people there were so bad." But that's really, in terms of the text itself, that's really almost an understated reason for why God is doing what God is doing. What God is doing is bringing the nation into the land uh, in fulfillment of the promises. And I think there's a lot of, again, a lot of interesting historically related recent scholarship that talks about how the land itself, lots of descriptions of the land portray it in temple language or use temple imagery.
yeah,
The same with the creation, Genesis 1 and 2.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's this idea that this people, in a sense, um, uh, a holy people and a holy land, a space. So not only is absolutely essential for God's objectives. So Israel is to be a holy people, and so humanity is redeemed. The land of Israel to be a holy land, so that creation itself is redeemed.
yeah. I like how you tie that together. Redeeming of creation, a temple. Yeah, that's very good, very helpful. Bringing the sort of the theology and the geography together. One point that you make, if we were to zoom out to the 30,000-foot view, is that God increases his apparent distance from humanity as the Old Testament goes on chronologically. We have the rededication of the Second Temple, which is not very impressive, either from its structure or the actual presence of God doesn't appear again. We have the silence of God in the book of Esther. But then in the New Testament, we have, God is back on the scene. And if we were to
Mm.
use the creation language again, we have another creation. We have the new
Mhm.
creation. And this is being brought about with violence, but it's God, the Son of God, subjecting himself to violence. So is this an inversion of the motif of violence in the Old
Mm.
Testament, or is this somehow expected? And then we also find God working not through kings and nations now, but working through a humble maiden named Mary.
Mm. Right. Yeah, I think an inversion is a good way to talk about it. Um, and so in a sense, uh, yeah. So what we see in the Old Testament is that this project where God identifies with a political entity really gets problematic, and that is not to say, and there is a perception that in a sense God is more remote, and that's not to say, by the way, that God in any way, shape, or form rejects the descendants of the Israelites or their descendants, or doesn't continue to be involved deeply in their lives. But it is to say that I think when we get into the New Testament, um, God God's choice to identify with the low and the meek and the oppressed and the powerless frees God in a way from all of these encumberments that constrained God um, when God was only identifying with a nation. So in a sense, God is free. Being on the bottom frees God to reveal who God truly is in the world, and that is a God who ultimately and willingly receives violence rather than metes out violence.
So this is the answer to question of Marcion and others. Effectively, is the different portraits of God in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Is that it's God? I think you put it page 199 in your book. You say to simplify, the Old Testament presents God at work primarily at the center of society, while the New Testament presents God at work primarily at the margins. So that's very well put. And you cite Luke as an example in the Song of Mary. You can kind of imagine the surprise of her. You know, God has chosen to
Mm.
work with the meek and the lowly, and so it's not different gods. It's God acting at the center or God acting at the fringe of human systems of the human world.
Yeah, which is if we look back into the Old Testament, which is a thread that has been there all the way through. I mean, there are so many, again, in the narrative literature in particular, there's so many instances when God clearly identifies and lifts up um, people who are outside or who are lowly or who are um, indigent. So the Book of Ruth being one of the great examples. So that it's not like this kind of God all of a sudden pops up and does something new, but there's been that thread that now, and maybe this is another inversion, which has been a softer voice in the Old Testament, and it becomes the primary voice in the New. Almost
Did
as
you,
if throughout the Old Testament, God is saying, you know, let me give you flashes and glimpses of
mm,
a fuller um, redeemed humanity in the midst of all of this mess. And then when we get into the New Testament, God gets to embody that in the person of Jesus Christ.
that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. Did you mention Ruth because you wrote a commentary on Ruth?
Yeah. Well, she's just the best example. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and there's another book where most of what we see about God is on the people, on the lips of people, and the only thing God actually is said to do in Ruth is to give Ruth a pregnancy.
Mm,
Um, it's such a beautiful little story that in the midst of this violent era of the judges, that says
yeah.
this is what life could be. if people were in a sense living by the fundamental dictates of what God had revealed in the Torah.
Yeah, and that's such a shock to read the book of Judges and then read verse 1 of Ruth, in the days when the judges ruled. So there are good people and they are doing stuff, and this is happening um, in the days when there were no kings and people did whatever they wanted to.
Yeah.
In the time of the judges. Fascinating. So you mentioned your commentary on Ruth, and just a broader question, in addition to your very helpful treatment of this topic of biblical violence. What, where else could you send viewers who are more interested in a narrative approach? Are there hermeneutical textbooks, just books by narrative critics that you would recommend, or anything like that?
Yes. Well, that's a good question. If just looking at the mechanics, um, Jerome Walsh has a good book on biblical narrative where he sets out some of the ways to read narrative and then works through kings. So gives you an exercise to do, and after that gives his own reading of the text. It's not style and structure in biblical narrative. I think the name's not coming to me right at the moment, but Jerome Walsh is the name. So that's a good text. Really, some of the folks who are writing for the Story of God theological commentary are really doing some interesting narrative work. So, for example, Lissa Ray Beale's commentary on Joshua, I think, is really taking hold of that narrative way of reading and in a very helpful way that models that. David Gunn, Introduction to Biblical Narrative. I mean, some of the older things, and I would say a lot of what we're calling now global readings or post-colonial readings are really focusing on narrative and key to a lot of the pieces of narrative because different cultures tell stories differently. Reading some individuals who are involved in global readings can really help us to read stories differently. So there's a book coming out for IVP called Reading the Bible. I think it's called Reading the Bible Around the World. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's people reading narrative texts. That's actually what they do, but coming at it from different social locations, and it really cracks open the multi-dimension nature of narrative and how it can generate conversations and insights and exciting exciting conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of the reason for the success of places like the Bible Project. You know, they're really good at
Yep.
narrative, and people. What are most people going to be interested in? You know, an approach to Genesis that picks it apart into pieces, and the Torah in general, and the rest of the Old Testament, or are they going to be interested in a narrative approach that engages the intellect and the emotion and gives you the big picture and actually uh, presents a helpful view of the text. I've read some criticisms of some really good scholars in their commentaries that say effectively, you know, the commentary it's brilliant, a brilliant commentary on the Hebrew text, but it doesn't help further your understanding at all. It's
Yeah.
just how many pieces can we separate the text into? So
Well,
I
this
hope
is
that
one of the
viewers.
things.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
I was going to say that's one of the things that actually drew me into a narrative, because
Mm.
I mean, if the Bible is primarily a historical textbook, then the people who interpret it rightly are historians, and that requires training. Everybody can read a story. Everybody knows how to interpret a story. And I just think that opens it up, opens scripture up in a fresh way for, you don't have to be a specialist.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, anybody can read the first 15 chapters of Exodus and see how Moses becomes Pharaoh and God becomes the gods of Egypt, and they can see the song at the sea and say, wow, this verse, well, let me just see if I can find it. We were talking about creation. You will bring them out and plant them on your own mountain. Planting, that's, wait, God planted a garden. Okay, so I see what we're doing here. Which a place which you've made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. Right. So, and then you can go from there, from planting to language of royalty. Right. Why does
Oh,
this
right.
stump out of the? It's like, and then and then you can think about Isaiah 11, but then a couple of chapters later, God says that He's going to make a nation of kings and priests. So yeah, it's royalty language there. And all of this it's there in the verse, but if you don't have this kind of big picture, this narrative in
Hmm.
view, then you'll just miss it. But
Yeah,
absolutely
right.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Professor Hawk, we are out of time, but it's been a real pleasure having you. Thank you so much for being with us.
And thank you so much for the invitation and the kind words. Thank you.
Everyone, follow the link in the description box because we've talked about a lot here in this hour, but nothing even close to what the book covers. So check the description box. There's a link to the book, The Violence of the Biblical God, and there's also a link to Dan's bio where you can read more about him. And I hope you enjoyed this interview. We have some really good stuff coming up on the channel. I'll be posting a video on an abnormal day, that is the 17th of so that would be, what is that, Tuesday or Thursday of next week, whatever it is, the 17th. You're definitely going to want to catch that video. Until then, thanks again for everyone, to everyone for watching, and to those who support the channel.